This is part 3 of lecture 30 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds on the Power of Monarchs. Now, I know this has already been a fairly long lecture because I've wanted to explain in detail a specific example of how important it was for monarchs to work with some of the other people in their respective territories of control. The word monarch may mean literally ruling alone, but no monarch was actually capable of ruling alone. They needed to get some form of consent, and a really powerful monarch managed to do this effectively and bring consent to them. An ineffective monarch like John alienated their nobles and chief men of the kingdom, and so was forced to bring these men's consent, was forced to consent to these men rather than the other way around. I'm going to briefly look at 2 other examples of how this political order would work in the High Middle Ages. Now, the first is the way that the church in Western Europe operated, and here we meet up again with Innocent III, probably the most powerful pope who has ever lived. And there certainly is an argument to be made for an idea of papal monarchy. That is, that the pope, at least in their own eyes, was supposed to be the person on the top of a hierarchy of power within the church system, which existed alongside the secular, that is, non-religious rulers in Europe, like the kings and emperors. First, it's worth noting the powers that the church had to work with, which were not necessarily military. Now, churchmen did rule over land. They would physically own land. That's where most of the wealth of the church came from in this time, and they might be able to raise some armies. The popes, as I've mentioned before, physically ruled an area around the city of Rome and certainly had some military forces, but these were relatively minor. Innocent III, however, is an excellent example of how popes could exert sort of a soft power rather than a hard military power. They could use their religious might to get their work done. And we've just seen one example of this in the case of John, that the pope could effectively tell the English church to go on strike against a secular monarch. The church could, of course, also excommunicate a person, meaning that they were officially outside of the church, could receive no sacraments, and other Christians weren't even supposed to communicate with them. When used against a king, this was basically an attempt to depose them, as we saw with John, although popes could go even further and physically declare a king unkinged, particularly a Holy Roman Emperor, because, of course, Holy Roman Emperors were supposed to be given their position as emperor literally by being crowned by the Pope. For deeply religious people, as most people were in the Middle Ages, this counted for a lot. In addition to this, the church also had its own courts and its own laws. These were based in form on old Roman civil laws, but this parallel set of legal structures in Europe was called canon law. This meant that all priests, for instance, could only be tried in church courts. They couldn't be tried by the courts of the king and the nobles. But it also extended over crucial matters even for non-priests. So, for instance, because marriage was a sacrament under Christianity, that is, was a religious ritual, the church controlled marriages. And thus, what alliances could be made, because remember, this was an important part of how politics worked in this time, because alliances were often sealed with actual marriages. And of course, this would also determine what children would be legitimate. And increasingly, as the church's power increased in this time period, it became less and less possible for someone like William the Bastard to end up taking over for his father when he was a bastard, that is, an illegitimate child. His parents were not married. And the whole feudal political system, with its personal and hereditary relationships, was thus, to some degree, beholden to church courts. Obviously, for those of you more familiar with the post-medieval period, this is going to be a key element in Henry VIII's decision to break away from the church, his desire to control his own marriage. The whole system, however, was very confusing. There were 2 sets of courts throughout Europe: secular courts that were ultimately beholden to the king or other secular monarch, and religious courts, which were theoretically ultimately beholden to the Pope. So who was ultimately in charge? The Pope as head of the church, or the monarchs of Europe? This is a question that we've seen goes all the way back to Charlemagne and his crowning on Christmas Day in the year 800 by the Pope. Back then, of course, as we saw, Charlemagne by far had the balance of power. But by the time we reach Innocent III, who was Pope from 1198 to 1216, and was eminently capable, the balance had swung much more in favor of the church than at any other time in the Middle Ages. And if you're looking for a sort of interesting middle point when this shift is really occurring, it was during that 11th century when we saw the investiture controversy going on and a great reform movement operating within the church that really tried to reclaim power for the church to appoint its own heads and ultimately really power for the popes themselves. The power of the papacy in the competent and determined hands of Innocent III. But while Innocent III used all the tools available to him, as we saw with John, Innocent, unlike John, also realized that he could not rule alone. So he called the largest church council of the Middle Ages, the Fourth Lateran Council, which met in 1215, notably the same year that Magna Carta came out. Now today, Magna Carta is far more famous than the Fourth Lateran Council, but if you asked anyone in 1215 what was the most important event happening in Europe, they would undoubtedly have told you that it was the Fourth Lateran Council. Remember, we've looked at church councils before, going all the way back to Constantine with that Council of Nicaea that had fundamentally decided the shape of Christianity in new ways. And ever since Constantine had made Christianity legal in the 4th century, church councils had been called to make the most important decisions affecting the whole church, like what was a heresy versus what was proper doctrine. Now, Innocent III as Pope might have liked to have thrown his weight around and seen himself as the ultimate authority in the church, but he knew that he needed to get the whole church on board to actually get his decisions carried out. And Lateran IV was the greatest church council that had met in hundreds of years, with hundreds of bishops and abbots in attendance. They may have acknowledged the superiority of the Pope in theory, but Innocent III was wise enough to take counsel from these churchmen, because it was only through them that he could act with any real authority. In other words, if they chose to ignore the Pope, there otherwise wasn't a lot that Innocent III could really do about it in this time period. So Innocent III wisely decided to ask for their advice and get them on board. Lateran IV, therefore, produced enormous amounts of legislation reforming and organizing the church in Western Europe, the Latin Church. It established and clarified doctrine, for instance, demanding better behavior and education from priests, and it organized the procedure of the bureaucracy of the church, all of which further established and centralized the power of the popes over the rest of the Western Church that had largely been theoretical before. This was the first major council called by a pope, not an emperor after all. Remember, Nicaea had not been called by the pope. Nicaea had been called by Constantine. Lateran IV condemned various heresies and then formally called the Fifth Crusade, that we'll be looking at in a later lecture, to reclaim Jerusalem. So Lateran IV, in other words, did a lot of different things. But finally, and with long and dark consequences, Lateran IV also called for numerous restrictions to be placed on Muslims and Jews who lived in Christian territory, like who they could marry, what jobs they could have, where they could live, and of course infamously mandated that all Jews and Muslims wear clothing that identified them as members of these minority religious communities. And with the bishops united, this actually became widely enforceable. The idea had been there. Certain places had already made these restrictions on Jews and Muslims living under Christian rule, but Innocent III is the one with the Fourth Lateran Council that makes this widespread across all of Western Latin Christianity. Innocent III masterfully understood how to rule by applying both the forceful measures available to him, like we saw with John, like interdict and excommunication, as well as calling crusades, like the Fourth and Fifth Crusades that we'll look at later, both of which were called ultimately by Innocent III. But he also knew how to rule through the hierarchy of the church, which required showing respect to and asking advice from and input from the bishops and abbots under his authority. In this respect, Innocent III presents the model example of how a medieval monarch should behave, which from a certain respect, as I said, he really was as Pope, while John's failure to respect his barons or to successfully exert his power proved disastrous. Monarchs had power, but they not only had to wield it effectively, they had to use it with discretion if they wanted to keep it, and that meant getting on board the people that they wanted to act through, whether those be the nobles of secular monarchs or the bishops of the church. A final example here from the Islamic world, which saw interesting changes during this era. Remember that the Islamic world no longer has a unifying caliph, as the Abbasid caliphs were now mere figureheads living in Baghdad, and Saladin, as we saw, deposed the last of the Shiite Fatimid caliphs in Cairo. And a variety of local rulers took over where they could, like Saladin, who ruled over a fairly large amount of territory in Egypt and the Levant. The most impressive of these rulers would take the title of sultan, and they relied on Turkish warriors for protection and military force, although they relied on the ulama, an educated bureaucratic elite class within Islamic society that we will examine next time, to actually run the civilian bureaucracy. This symbiosis did produce a kind of cooperation between the sultans and the leading men of their kingdoms, comparable to, but culturally distinct from, either the parliaments evolving in England or the councils working for the papacy. A new quirk of Muslim civilization in the High Middle Ages was the creation of Mamluk dynasties, most famously in Egypt, where the Mamluks overthrew the heirs of Saladin in 1250. But Mamluks are not a traditional kind of dynasty. Mamluks are not a family. Mamluks were slaves. The word Mamluk even means owned. But this was a kind of slavery very different from what you were likely familiar with. Mamluks were purchased as slaves in childhood or in their teenage years from outside of the Islamic world, usually from steppe nomads, either by the Black Sea or from Central Asia. Notably, it was illegal to enslave a fellow Muslim under Islamic law. These non-Muslims from outside the Islamic world were then brought to the Islamic world and then converted to Islam and freed, but raised to be loyal to their former owner, as well as to be spectacular warriors. That's also part of why they were recruited from the steppe nomads, who were seen as being a more warlike people than the urban civilization in the central parts of the Islamic world. The idea was that these Mamluks would have no local connections, since they had come from so far abroad and weren't even originally from within Muslim society, and therefore these Mamluks would be loyal first to their sultan. That system was common throughout the Muslim world and had been for several centuries. Saladin, for instance, had a Mamluk bodyguard. The elite forces in the army were often slaves or former slave warriors. This is not terribly different from other societies. Slavery in many societies was a way of forcibly integrating new members into the society. Romans had also, for instance, done this, although Muslims did take a rather unusual but not entirely unique approach of actually turning these slaves into warriors. But interestingly, in Egypt at about this time, these Mamluks proved that they were more loyal to each other than to the dynasty that they had been bought to serve. The Mamluks, and we'll look at the exact specific details of how this happened in a later lecture, overthrew Saladin's heirs, the Ayyubid dynasty, and they instead set up their own Mamluk commanders in their place as sultans. Now, the system might never have worked, but it turns out that the Mamluks were very successful, and they didn't rock the basic principles of the Islamic political boat. Most importantly, they got the local bureaucratic elites, these ulama that we'll look at next time, on board with them. They continued the symbiotic relationship with the educated elites that the Turkish dynasties before them had observed. They also kept the existing ikta system that we looked at in our lecture on feudal institutions and saw wasn't really quite the same thing as feudalism. But unlike the previous dynasties, Mamluks could not appoint their children or other relatives as their heirs. And that's because their children were born Muslim and therefore could not be enslaved as Mamluks. Only a member of the strange, formerly enslaved group of outsiders could become a ruler, and therefore, a competent military commander could gain the support of the other Mamluks and be acclaimed sultan when the previous one died. It was a unique solution to the problem of choosing a qualified successor in a monarchical system. Now, that's not to say that some of them didn't manage to find ways around it, and certainly some assassinating of predecessors took place under the Mamluks. But the Mamluks ultimately proved themselves legitimate by being militarily competent. As we shall see, they alone managed to defeat the Mongols, who conquered all other Muslim resistance in their path at the famous Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. And after that prestigious victory, the Mamluks went on to destroy the last outposts of the Crusaders in Outremer, again, as we'll look at in a later lecture. The Mamluks were vicious, they worked within a highly militarized hierarchy. But they were ultimately respected by their Arab and other Muslim subjects because they were effective warriors who basically left the civilian bureaucracy alone, and they had the support of their fellow Mamluks. That's how one became the next Mamluk sultan, was by the acclaim of the most important Mamluks. Again, ruling to some degree by consent. And the system of the Mamluks worked remarkably well. For over 250 years, from about 1250 until about 1500, the Mamluks ruled not only Egypt, but the Levant as far north as Syria, and the Hejaz down to the cities of Mecca and Medina on the coast of Arabia. And they were therefore the preeminent and central political authority in the now fragmented Islamic world. It wasn't the caliphate of old, but it was a very powerful and long-lasting system, one that, it should be noted, lasted longer than the United States has yet been an independent country. So, in this last part 3 of our lecture on the power of monarchs, we've looked at two counter-examples to the one that we spent most of our time on in England, that is, how monarchical systems could work within the church, within Western Latin Europe, and also in the Islamic world with the new unique situation of the Mamluks. And in all of these situations, what we've seen is there had to be some form of gaining consent from other members of the political classes in society, even if ultimately the head of each of these systems, whether that be a king in England, a pope within the Western Latin Church, or a sultan amongst the Mamluks, was theoretically in sole command at the top of the hierarchy. Despite being the ultimate leader of a hierarchy, they still had to work with, in each of these cases, the lower members of that hierarchy to at least some degree. All right, with that, we will leave this lecture and move on to look at education next time.